She fought for her place in the cockpit, then uncovered a truth that brought an entire airline to its knees. When a black female pilot was denied entry to the cockpit, she refused to back down. But what started as discrimination soon unraveled into a shocking airline cover-up, one that put thousands of lives at risk. What she did next shook the entire industry. Before we get into this unforgettable story, make sure you're subscribed to Epic Story Moments. Don't forget to hit that bell so you never miss another amazing tale. If you enjoy the story, like, share, and leave a comment. It helps us bring more heartwarming stories your way. And we'd love to know, where are you watching from? Let's stay connected. Avery Morrison grew up in a small town where the roar of airplanes overhead felt like a call to destiny. As a child, she would press her face against the chain-link fence bordering the local airport, watching in awe as planes lifted effortlessly into the sky. While other children played with dolls or video games, Avery built model aircraft, memorized flight patterns, and dreamed of the day she would command the skies herself. Her grandmother, a strong woman who had marched for civil rights decades earlier, recognized the fire in Avery's eyes. "You have to fly higher than they think you can," she would whisper, stroking Avery's curls as they sat on the porch, watching planes disappear beyond the horizon. But dreaming and doing were two very different things. From the moment Avery voiced her ambition to become a pilot, she was met with skepticism. Teachers encouraged her to aim for something more practical. Friends teased her, and even her own mother, who worked two exhausting jobs to support their household, worried about whether such a path was even possible for a black girl. Despite the doubt surrounding her, Avery remained determined. She poured herself into school, excelling in math and science, knowing that aviation required both skill and discipline. When she found out about a small aviation club at her high school, she eagerly signed up, only to be met with quiet stares and reluctant greetings from her mostly white, male classmates. Some outright dismissed her, assuming she had joined out of curiosity rather than commitment. The first time she sat in a flight simulator, her hands trembled with a mix of excitement and fear. The instructor, a grizzled former pilot, barely looked at her as he explained the controls. "You sure you want to be here?" he asked, his tone making it clear that she didn't belong. Avery didn't answer. She simply tightened her grip on the yoke and focused on the screen in front of her. The simulated aircraft responded to her touch, tilting, turning, climbing. It was a small victory, but one that solidified what she already knew. This was where she was meant to be. She trained harder than anyone, staying late to study navigation charts and practice landings. While others dismissed her as a novelty, she logged hours in the simulator, determined to prove she wasn't just there to try. She was there to stay. When it came time for college applications, Avery set her sights on an aeronautical university that offered one of the best flight programs in the country. Despite her stellar grades, she knew tuition was out of reach. Her grandmother, ever her champion, encouraged her to apply for scholarships. One evening, after weeks of waiting, an envelope arrived in the mail. Avery tore it open with shaking hands and read the first line. "Congratulations, you have been awarded a full scholarship." Tears welled in her eyes as she clutched the letter to her chest. She had done it. She was one step closer to the cockpit. Arriving at the flight school, however, brought new challenges. She was one of the few black students and one of even fewer women. The feeling of being out of place was immediate. Instructors often overlooked her, assuming she was struggling before she even had a chance to prove herself. Other students, whether intentionally or not, made her feel like an outsider. Yet Avery did what she had always done. She put her head down and worked. She logged flight hours, studied tirelessly, and made sure no one could question her ability. One instructor, Ethan Delgado, took notice. Unlike the others, he saw her for her talent, not her background. "You've got a natural feel for the yoke," he told her after a particularly smooth landing. "Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." Those words became her anchor. She carried them through sleepless nights and moments of self-doubt. She carried them when other students whispered that she was just a diversity hire, when instructors hesitated before praising her, when she was constantly reminded that she had to be twice as good just to be seen as equal. By the time she completed her training, Avery had already made an impression on recruiters. The aviation industry was facing a pilot shortage, and airlines were eager to bring in new talent. Yet, despite glowing recommendations and a flawless flight record, she faced rejection after rejection. Some airlines cited better fits without explanation. Others praised her experience, but offered nothing beyond empty encouragement. She knew what was really happening. Despite her qualifications, some simply weren't ready to welcome a black woman into the cockpit. Then came Skynova Airlines. Unlike the others, they saw her potential. The airline was expanding, looking to make a name for itself, and Avery fit the bill. When she received a job offer, it felt like validation. Her first day at Skynova was overwhelming. Paperwork, training modules, meeting new colleagues. Some were welcoming, genuinely impressed by her credentials. Others were more reserved, their smiles not quite reaching their eyes. And then there was Captain Martin Harlow. The first time she met him, his handshake was brief, his greeting clipped. He barely acknowledged her during training sessions, never offering the same camaraderie he gave to other first officers. It was subtle, but Avery recognized it for what it was. He didn't believe she belonged. Still, she pushed forward. She had fought too hard to let one man's attitude shake her. She had earned her place in that cockpit. But what Avery didn't know was that her biggest challenge wasn't just proving herself as a pilot. It was proving that the very airline she had fought to be a part of was hiding dangerous secrets. Avery's first official flight with Skynova was a short regional route, but the weight of the occasion was immense. Wearing her crisp uniform and stepping onto the tarmac, she could feel the eyes of the ground crew following her, some curious, others skeptical. Inside the cockpit, she found Captain Martin Harlow already seated, running through pre-flight checks with methodical precision. His graying hair and stern expression gave him an air of authority that was both intimidating and dismissive. Avery greeted him politely, but he only responded with a curt nod, his eyes never meeting hers. As they prepared for takeoff, Harlow's disdain became evident. He offered clipped instructions and refused to engage in the small talk that typically filled the cockpit. Every suggestion Avery made was met with a dismissive grunt or an outright challenge, as if he was waiting for her to make a mistake. During one flight, as they navigated a patch of turbulence, Avery calmly suggested a minor course correction to avoid stronger headwinds. Harlow shot her a glare, his tone icy. "Just stick to your side of the cockpit, Morrison. I've been flying these routes longer than you've been alive." The sting of his words was sharp, but Avery remained composed, focusing on her instruments. Her every move was scrutinized, each decision questioned, as though she were an unqualified intruder in his domain. But the most blatant insult came one morning before a scheduled flight to Miami. Arriving early, Avery headed to the cockpit only to find Harlow blocking the entrance, his arms crossed over his chest. "You're early," he remarked coldly, his gaze hard. "I like to run through my checks ahead of time," Avery responded evenly, trying to step past him. Harlow didn't move. "You don't belong here," he said quietly, the malice in his voice unmistakable. "Some of us earned our place. Others are just here to fill a quota." Avery felt her face flush with anger, but she refused to give him the satisfaction of seeing her react. "I earned my wings just like everyone else, Captain," she replied, her voice steady. With a huff, Harlow finally stepped aside, but the damage was done. The cockpit, once a symbol of her dreams, now felt like a hostile territory. As flights continued, Harlow's antagonism persisted. He would make belittling remarks in front of the cabin crew, question her capabilities during critical moments, and undermine her authority whenever possible. The stress began to seep into her personal life, and the weight of constant scrutiny felt unbearable. In these dark moments, Avery found solace in her growing friendship with Bianca Moore, a seasoned flight attendant who had seen her fair share of workplace discrimination. During layovers, They would sit together in empty airport lounges, sharing stories of prejudice and perseverance. "Don't let him get to you," Bianca would encourage, her eyes fierce with solidarity. "They're just scared of what you represent. Change." It was through Bianca that Avery learned about Ethan Delgado's presence at Skynova. Now a contract pilot with the airline, Ethan had always been a source of unwavering support during her training days. When she finally crossed paths with him again, his warm smile felt like a lifeline. "Still flying high, Morrison?" he asked with a grin as they shared a coffee in the terminal. "Trying to, despite some turbulence," Avery admitted, her voice tinged with frustration. Ethan's expression grew serious. "Harlow," he guessed. Avery nodded, and Ethan sighed, shaking his head. "You don't have to prove anything to him. Just keep doing what you're doing. The skies don't care about prejudice, only skill." His words buoyed her spirits, reminding her that the cockpit was hers as much as anyone else's. With every flight, she continued to perform her duties with precision and professionalism, refusing to let Harlow's hostility derail her. However, it wasn't just Harlow. Avery began noticing the subtle ways racism permeated the airline's culture. Colleagues would avoid eye contact. Passengers would double-check her credentials when they saw her in uniform, and whispers followed her down terminals. Yet, she pressed on, determined to carve out her space in an industry resistant to change. Bianca became her confidant, sharing stories of other employees who had faced similar discrimination. Together, they formed a small but resilient support system, drawing strength from each other's experiences. Though the challenges were relentless, Avery knew that she wasn't flying alone. With allies like Bianca and Ethan by her side, she prepared for the battles ahead, both in the cockpit and beyond. Avery had always believed that aviation was built on precision, discipline, and above all, safety. But the deeper she settled into her role at Skynova, the more she began to notice unsettling cracks in the system. At first, they were minor, small discrepancies in pre-flight checklists, maintenance logs missing proper signatures, flight attendants murmuring about faulty cabin lights that flickered on and off mid-flight. These things weren't uncommon in the industry. But what unsettled Avery was how quickly they were brushed aside. One morning, during a routine pre-flight inspection, she noticed that a hydraulic fluid indicator was slightly off. She double-checked the numbers and brought it up to Captain Laurel Hayes, a no-nonsense pilot known for her meticulous approach. Hayes frowned, reviewing the logs. "I'll have maintenance take another look," she said. The mechanics arrived, gave the system a quick once-over, and assured them it was fine. But when Avery pressed for details, the crew chief hesitated before mumbling, "It's probably just a sensor issue." Probably. That word stuck with her as they took off. Everything went smoothly, but the unease lingered. Was Skynova rushing maintenance checks? A few days later, while reviewing an aircraft log before a flight, Avery spotted another issue. A previous flight had reported inconsistent readings from one of the plane's fuel sensors, but the log simply read, "Cleared for flight, no details." No mechanic's signature. She took it to the gate crew, who dismissed her concerns. If it was serious, they wouldn't let the plane fly, one of them said with a shrug. It was the same dismissive attitude she'd seen over and over again. Every concern was met with the same response. "It's fine." But was it? Avery began listening more carefully to the whispers among the staff. Mechanics complained about being rushed through inspections, ground crews grumbled about unrealistic turnaround times, and flight attendants nervously exchanged stories about emergency lights failing at the wrong moments. It wasn't just an oversight here or there. It was a pattern. One night, after a long-haul flight, Bianca pulled her aside in the break room. "I overheard something you need to know," she whispered, glancing around to make sure they were alone. "Some of the senior flight attendants are saying Skynova is skipping routine checks to keep flights on schedule. I even heard about an incident where an oxygen mask system was faulty, and instead of replacing it immediately, they just marked it as a low-priority fix." Avery's stomach tightened. An oxygen mask system labeled as low priority? Bianca leaned in closer. Word is, they're under pressure from the top. Management doesn't want delays, and if a problem isn't critical, it gets pushed to the next maintenance cycle. That's why things keep slipping through the cracks. Avery exhaled slowly, her mind racing. This wasn't just carelessness. This was deliberate negligence. She knew she couldn't stay silent. The next day, she walked into the flight operations office and requested a meeting with her supervisor. When she brought up the safety concerns, the response was as frustrating as she feared. "These things happen in every airline," her supervisor said, leaning back in his chair. "You're new, Morrison. You'll learn that not every little blip is a cause for alarm." "But these aren't little blips," Avery insisted. "We're talking about mechanical failures that could become serious issues mid-flight." Her supervisor sighed. "Look, I appreciate your diligence, but you're a pilot, not a mechanic. Let the ground crew handle maintenance." Avery left the office fuming. They weren't just ignoring the problem. They were actively discouraging her from looking deeper. She needed help. That's when Bianca mentioned someone who might be able to provide it. Jocelyn Reed, a union representative who had been quietly gathering reports of safety violations at Skynova. "She's been fighting this battle for a while," Bianca explained. "If anyone knows how to take this higher, it's her." Avery hesitated. Speaking to a union rep felt like a big step, one that could easily put a target on her back. But the alternative was worse. She agreed to meet. That evening, in a quiet coffee shop near the airport, Avery sat across from Jocelyn Reed, a sharp-eyed woman with an air of quiet authority. "I've heard about you," Reed said, stirring her tea. "You've got a reputation for being sharp. I assume you're here because you're seeing what the rest of us have seen." Avery nodded, then laid everything out. The rushed inspections, the ignored warnings, the unsettling patterns she was beginning to connect. Reed listened without interrupting. When Avery finished, the union rep set down her cup and folded her hands. "You're right," she said simply. "And it's worse than you think." She leaned in. "We've been collecting evidence for months. Maintenance records, testimony from mechanics, even a few leaked memos from corporate. Skynova's pushing for maximum efficiency at the cost of safety, and they're hoping no one will call them out on it." Avery felt a chill run through her. "So, what do we do?" Reed studied her for a moment before speaking. "We need someone on the inside, someone in the cockpit who's willing to help us build an airtight case. Someone who can document everything." Avery's pulse quickened. She had come looking for answers, but she hadn't expected to be asked to take action. "This won't be easy," Reed warned. "If Skynova catches wind of this, they'll do everything they can to shut you down. But if you're serious about making a change, you won't be alone. We can protect you." Avery didn't hesitate. "I'm in," she said. She had spent her entire life fighting to belong in the cockpit. Now, she was about to fight for something even bigger: the safety of everyone who stepped onto a Skynova plane. Avery knew that if she was going to expose Skynova's negligence, she needed proof, something undeniable, something that couldn't be dismissed as paranoia or inexperience. So she began documenting everything. Each time she noticed a discrepancy in a maintenance log, she took a photo. Whenever a mechanic seemed hesitant about signing off on a repair, she made a note. She kept a small notebook tucked inside her flight bag, filled with dates, flight numbers, and whispered warnings from ground crew members too afraid to speak up. She was careful, never outright accusing anyone, never making it obvious that she was collecting evidence. But she could feel the walls closing in. It wasn't long before Captain Harlow noticed. One afternoon, before a flight to Dallas, Avery was running through the pre-flight checklist when Harlow leaned back in his seat, watching her. "You've been asking a lot of questions lately," he said, his tone casual but laced with something darker. Avery didn't look up. "Just being thorough, Captain." Harlow chuckled, but there was no humor in it. "Thorough is good, but stepping out of line? That's another story." He turned to face her fully, his expression hard. "You're new here, Morrison. Let me give you some advice. Just do your job. Don't go poking around in things that don't concern you. Avery, clench your jaw. Safety concerns all of us. Harlow's smirk faded. And so does knowing when to keep your mouth shut. It was a warning, and Avery knew exactly what it meant. Hashtag the flight that almost went wrong. A few days later, she was scheduled for a late-night flight from Chicago to Denver. The aircraft had been flagged for a minor electrical issue earlier that week, but the maintenance logs now showed it as resolved. Still, something felt off. As they reached cruising altitude, a sudden flicker of cabin lights caught her attention. A moment later, the overhead indicators flashed erratically before stabilizing. Then the cockpit alarm sounded. Avery's heart pounded as she scanned the instruments. The system was flagging an electrical malfunction. "Captain, we have an active warning," she said quickly. Captain Russell Kane, who was piloting this flight, frowned but didn't seem overly concerned. "It's probably a sensor issue. These old birds act up all the time." Avery wasn't convinced. "We should consider an alternate landing," she urged. Kane shook his head. "We'll monitor it for now. No need to cause a panic." But minutes later, flight attendants reported a burning smell coming from the rear of the cabin. That was it. Avery refused to stay silent. She turned to Kane, her voice firm. "Captain, we need to divert. Now." Something in her tone must have struck him, because after a tense pause, he gave the order. They rerouted to the nearest major airport, where emergency crews were already waiting on the tarmac. As soon as the plane landed, maintenance crews rushed on board. Avery stood near the open cockpit door as a mechanic ran past, his expression grave. "Damn lucky you landed," he muttered under his breath. This wiring was one spark away from a real problem. Avery's stomach twisted. One spark away. If they had continued to Denver, the results could have been catastrophic. Hashtag the aftermath. Instead of being commended for catching the issue, Avery felt the weight of Skynova's wrath. Management downplayed the incident, labeling it a minor systems glitch rather than an actual hazard. No public statement, no investigation, just a quiet attempt to move on as if nothing had happened. But the crew knew the truth. Bianca was the first to find Avery after the emergency landing. "That was close," she said, shaking her head. "Too close?" She wasn't the only one shaken. Other flight attendants, ones who had heard the passengers panicking, who had smelled the burning wires, started coming to Avery, whispering their own concerns. "I've seen weird electrical issues on other flights," one confided. "But every time we report them, they just tell us it's fine." Another flight attendant added, "We had a pressurization warning last week." The captain filed a report, but nothing came of it. Slowly, more voices joined Avery's. The system was cracking, and she knew that if she pushed hard enough, it would break. Avery had seen enough. The ignored safety warnings, rushed inspections, and near disasters weren't isolated incidents. They were part of a systemic failure that put passengers' lives at risk. She spent her nights meticulously compiling everything. Flight logs with missing maintenance records, photos of questionable repairs, reports from flight attendants, and testimonies from mechanics too afraid to speak up. Each piece of evidence painted a damning picture. Skynova was cutting corners, prioritizing profits over safety. She knew what she had to do. One evening, she met with Jocelyn Reed again, this time handing over a thick folder of evidence. Reed flipped through the documents, her expression unreadable. "This is enough," Reed finally said. "We can take this to the FAA." Avery exhaled slowly, knowing there was no turning back. Hashtag the backlash begins. The first sign that Skynova knew came subtly. Avery's flight assignments were suddenly changed, her usual routes were reassigned, and instead, she was given inconvenient schedules, overnight shifts, last-minute calls, and longer layovers that kept her away from home. Then came the whispers. Colleagues who once greeted her warmly now avoided eye contact. Some stopped speaking to her entirely. In the pilot's lounge, she could feel the stares, the murmured conversations stopping whenever she walked past. One day, Bianca found her pacing in the crew lounge, tension in every step. "They know," Avery muttered. Bianca frowned. "What do you mean?" Avery handed her a printed email she had found in a shared folder, an internal memo from Skynova's management. Employees are reminded to uphold the company's reputation. Negative discussions about operations will not be tolerated. Loyalty to the airline is expected. It wasn't a direct attack, but Avery knew the message was meant for her. Bianca read the memo and cursed under her breath. "They're trying to intimidate you." Avery wasn't afraid, but she was angry. Hashtag the breaking point. It wasn't until she was called into a meeting with HR that she realized how far Skynova was willing to go. "We received complaints about your conduct," the HR manager said, sliding a file across the desk. Avery opened it. Inside were fabricated accusations, claims that she was being insubordinate, questioning her captains, and causing unnecessary delays. She clenched her jaw. "This is retaliation." The HR manager feigned sympathy. "We just want to ensure a smooth working environment, Avery. Maybe it would be best if you focused on your duties instead of causing disruptions." It was a thinly veiled threat. They wanted her to back down, to stay silent. Instead, she doubled down. Hashtag the FAA steps in. 2 weeks later, the FAA launched an official investigation into Skynova. Inspectors arrived unannounced, combing through maintenance logs, interviewing staff, and reviewing flight records. Rumors spread fast. Something big was happening. Skynova scrambled to control the damage. Executives held emergency meetings, issuing false assurances to employees. Some pilots were pressured into downplaying issues to FAA investigators. The company even leaked a story suggesting Avery had a personal vendetta, trying to discredit her before the truth could take hold. But it was too late. The evidence was in the FAA's hands. And Avery knew. Skynova's days of hiding the truth were over. Avery arrived at the airport early for her next scheduled flight, a routine trip to Denver. As she approached the aircraft, she immediately noticed a group of mechanics leaving the plane, their expressions tense. One of them, a younger technician she had spoken to before, hesitated when he saw her. "Everything good with the plane?" she asked casually, though her instincts told her otherwise. The mechanic glanced around before lowering his voice. "They pushed this one through fast. There was an issue with the landing gear indicator earlier, but they told us to sign off on it. No time for a full recheck." Avery's stomach clenched. This was exactly the kind of negligence she had been documenting. A faulty landing gear indicator wasn't something that could be ignored. She thanked him and boarded the plane, making her way to the cockpit where Captain Harlow was already seated. He barely looked up. "Took you long enough," he muttered, flipping through the pre-flight checklist. Avery strapped in, opened the flight logs, and immediately spotted the problem. The maintenance entry for the landing gear issue had been marked resolved, but there were no signatures, no technician confirmation, nothing verifying that the issue had been fully addressed. She took a steady breath. "Captain, the maintenance log isn't complete. We need clearance before we take off." Harlow exhaled sharply, setting his checklist down with an irritated sigh. If it was serious, they wouldn't have cleared the flight. "That's the problem. It's not properly cleared," Avery pressed. He turned to her, his eyes narrowing. "You're overstepping." Avery didn't flinch. "I'm doing my job. We need to call maintenance back and get confirmation." The tension thickened between them. Harlow leaned closer, his voice dropping low. "Listen to me, Morrison. You've been making waves ever since you got here, acting like you know better than pilots with years of experience. But let me make something clear. You are not in charge. I am." Avery's grip tightened on the armrest. "And as first officer, it's my responsibility to make sure we're following procedure. This plane doesn't leave the ground until we get the proper sign-off." Harlow's expression darkened, his jaw tightening. "Fine," he snapped, shoving his seat back. "But when we're delayed, it's on you." He stormed out of the cockpit to call maintenance, leaving Avery alone, her hands trembling with frustration. 10 minutes later, a mechanic arrived and confirmed Avery's suspicions. The landing gear issue hadn't been fully inspected. If they had taken off, there was no guarantee the gear would have properly deployed for landing. When Harlow returned, his face was tight with barely contained anger. "Hope you're happy," he muttered as he sat down, adjusting his headset with sharp, jerky movements. Avery didn't respond, because in that moment, she didn't care about his resentment. She cared about the fact that she had just prevented a potential catastrophe. But the fallout came faster than she expected. By the time they landed in Denver, she was pulled aside by flight operations. A formal complaint had been filed against her, *** by Harlow, ***. The flight operations manager, Sharon Perry, sat across from her in a small, windowless office, arms crossed. "Captain Harlow claims you were insubordinate and caused an unnecessary delay." Avery kept her voice calm. "I followed standard safety protocols. The maintenance log was incomplete." Perry studied her for a long moment before exhaling. "Look, I'm going to be honest with you. Harlow is well connected. His complaint won't be ignored." Avery met her gaze. "So, you're saying that doing the right thing is a problem?" Perry hesitated but didn't answer. Instead, she handed Avery a document. "You're being placed on administrative suspension, pending further review effective immediately." Avery felt the blood drain from her face. She had seen this coming, but that didn't make it any easier. She walked out of the office, her mind racing. She had done everything by the book. She had followed regulations. And still, she was the one being punished. Bianca was waiting for her outside the crew lounge, her face full of concern. "What happened?" Avery handed her the suspension notice. Bianca's expression twisted in anger. "They're trying to shut you up." Avery swallowed hard. "It's not going to work." And it didn't. By the next morning, news of her suspension had leaked. A flight attendant who had witnessed the confrontation with Harlow spoke out online, detailing how Avery had simply followed protocol while Skynova retaliated against her. Within hours, the post went viral, drawing attention from aviation watchdogs, pilots' unions, and even national news outlets. Then came the biggest blow to Skynova yet. The FAA stepped in ***, with their ongoing investigation already underway. Avery's suspension was the final straw. The agency ordered an immediate audit of Skynova's entire fleet, grounding multiple flights. Passengers were left stranded. News headlines swarmed with questions, and Skynova's leadership was suddenly facing more scrutiny than ever before. Avery sat at home, scrolling through the breaking news on her phone. She had lost her position, for now, but she had won something bigger. Skynova was finally being held accountable. Avery refused to let her suspension be the end of the fight. If anything, it was just the beginning. The moment she was forced off duty, she doubled down on exposing Skynova's failures. She worked closely with Jocelyn Reed and the pilots' union, compiling every bit of evidence they had gathered. FAA officials reached out to her directly, requesting detailed accounts of ignored maintenance issues, rushed inspections, and internal pressure to overlook safety concerns. Avery gave them everything: emails, maintenance records, photos of incomplete logbooks, statements from flight attendants and mechanics who had spoken to her in hushed voices, terrified of retaliation. Then, something unexpected happened. ***, more employees began stepping forward, ***. It started with the mechanics. A few, emboldened by the FAA's presence, admitted that they had been pressured to sign off on incomplete repairs or had been given unrealistic deadlines to finish maintenance checks. Then flight attendants joined in, sharing stories of faulty emergency equipment, failing oxygen masks, and warnings that were quietly dismissed by corporate. Even some pilots, veterans of the airline, broke their silence. I've seen this happening for years, one captain admitted in a confidential meeting with investigators. But anyone who spoke up either got reassigned to dead-end routes or quietly pushed out. The floodgates had opened. Skynova's management tried to contain the damage. They issued internal memos denying wrongdoing, insisting that safety had always been their top priority. But the media storm was growing. A leaked internal report from the FAA confirmed what Avery had been saying all along. Skynova had ignored critical safety concerns to keep flights running on time. That was the tipping point. Passengers demanded answers. Families who had flown on Skynova in recent months went public with their fears, some recounting moments when their flights had experienced strange malfunctions that were never fully explained. And then came the biggest blow to Skynova yet. Investors started pulling out. The airline stock plummeted. Executives scrambled to control the chaos, offering public reassurances, promising internal reviews, and vowing to do better. But it wasn't enough. FAA officials, alongside whistleblowers like Avery, pushed for immediate corporate reform. Skynova was forced to ground dozens of aircraft for deeper inspections. Some flights were outright canceled, costing the airline millions in lost revenue. Then, Martin Harlow disappeared from the company. A quiet email was sent out internally. Harlow had chosen to take an early retirement. But everyone knew the truth. He had become too much of a liability. His public confrontation with Avery, his treatment of junior pilots, and his outdated attitudes had finally caught up to him. Avery heard about it from Bianca, who called her the moment the news broke. "They force him out," Bianca said, almost breathless. No farewell party. No official announcement. Just gone. Avery didn't celebrate, but she felt a wave of vindication. It wasn't just about Harlow. It was about the culture he represented. The one that had tried to push her out, the one that had tried to silence her, the one that had protected incompetence over accountability. And now, that culture was collapsing. Skynova had no choice but to change or collapse. Under FAA pressure, public scrutiny, and financial losses, the airline announced a massive overhaul of its safety procedures. New policies were put in place, requiring stricter maintenance oversight, independent audits, and whistleblower protections to prevent another cover-up. But it wasn't just about safety anymore. The investigation had also exposed deep-rooted bias within the company. How pilots like Avery faced discrimination, exclusion, and unfair scrutiny just for existing in spaces where they weren't expected. Skynova's new leadership issued a statement promising to do better. They introduced diversity training, stronger anti-discrimination policies, and a commitment to hiring and promoting more women and minority pilots. Avery read the announcement from the sidelines. She wasn't part of the company anymore. They had pushed her out, But then, her phone rang. It was Jocelyn Reed. "They want you back," Reed said, barely able to hide her satisfaction. "They're offering full reinstatement." Avery exhaled, her mind racing. She had fought so hard to stand her ground, but now they wanted her back. Not as a problem, but as a necessity, She had the power now. Before accepting, Avery made one condition. She wouldn't return unless Skynova followed through on every single promise they had made. No empty PR stunts. No quiet backpedaling. Skynova agreed. And so, after months of suspension, uncertainty, and a public battle that almost ended her career, Avery walked back into the pilot's lounge. Some people still looked at her with hesitation, but many more nodded with quiet respect. Her return wasn't just a personal victory, it was a symbol of change. Hashtag, a voice beyond the cockpit. Avery didn't stop at just returning to work. She became a speaker, an advocate, a force in aviation reform. She was invited to speak at industry conferences, universities, and flight schools, sharing her journey with aspiring pilots, especially young women and minorities who had been told they didn't belong in the sky. One day, after finishing a speech at a flight academy, a young black girl approached her. "You're the reason I didn't quit," she said shyly, clutching a notebook filled with notes. "I want to be a pilot too, Avery smiled, placing a steady hand on the girl's shoulder. Then don't let anyone stop you. Hashtag, hashtag, hashtag a moment of closure. Through it all, Avery's biggest supporter had been her grandmother. One evening, after yet another news feature about her fight against Sky Nova, she sat beside her grandmother, who was now frail but still sharp. "You did it," her grandmother whispered, a proud smile forming. "You flew higher than they ever wanted you to." Avery swallowed the lump in her throat, squeezing her grandmother's hand. "I had to." Her grandmother reached into a small wooden box and pulled out a tiny, worn metal pin. A bird's wing, delicate but strong. "This was my mother's," she said. "Now it's yours." A reminder that some dreams take generations to reach the sky. Avery pinned it to her uniform the next day, a permanent symbol of where she came from and where she was going. Hashtag, hashtag, hashtag a reunion in the skies. A few weeks later, Avery prepared for her first flight since her reinstatement. As she stepped into the cockpit, she found her co-pilot already waiting. Asterisk, asterisk, Ethan Delgado, asterisk, asterisk. "Well," Ethan said with a grin, "it's about time." Avery smirked, settling into her seat. "Let's see if I still remember how to fly." Ethan chuckled. "Something tells me you never forgot." And as the plane lifted off, Avery felt it. That familiar rush, that unshakable certainty. She was where she belonged, and nothing was going to ground her ever again. Avery had spent years fighting for her place in the cockpit. Now, the left seat was finally hers. She stood at the entrance of the jet bridge, uniform crisp, captain stripes gleaming on her shoulders. The moment felt surreal. The same airport where she had once been denied entry to the cockpit was now the place where she would command her first flight as Captain Avery Morrison. She took a steady breath before stepping into the cockpit. The seat, asterisk, asterisk her seat now, asterisk, asterisk felt different, heavier. It wasn't just about flying anymore. It was about everything she had fought for, everything she had endured. As she adjusted the controls, the co-pilot entered. A young man, maybe mid-20s, with bright eyes and a nervous energy. He stopped short when he saw her, blinking as if caught off guard. "You're Captain Morrison?" he asked, all creeping into his voice. Avery turned, giving him a knowing smile. She had seen that look before. The look of someone who had been told that people like her didn't exist in this seat. "That's me," she said, extending her hand. "And you are, First Officer Daniel Carter." He shook her hand firmly, still looking at her like he was meeting a legend. "It's an honor to fly with you, Captain." Avery chuckled, settling into her seat. "Well, let's see if you can keep up." As they prepared for takeoff, she let the moment sink in. She thought about Bianca, still flying with Sky Nova, helping make the cabin safer for crew and passengers. She thought about Jocelyn Reed, still pushing for stronger regulations, making sure no airline ever got away with cutting corners again. She thought about her grandmother's words, "You flew higher than they ever wanted you to." And she thought about Martin Harlow. There was no anger left. He had been forced into early retirement, his legacy erased by the very system he had tried to protect. Avery had won, not just for herself, but for every pilot, mechanic, and flight attendant who had been afraid to speak up. Hashtag, hashtag, hashtag a new chapter in the skies. The engines roared to life, the familiar vibrations steadying her heartbeat. She glanced at First Officer Carter, who was watching her intently. "You ready?" she asked. He nodded quickly. "Absolutely." Avery gripped the controls. The runway stretched ahead, the sky waiting. As the plane lifted off, she made a silent promise. "In my cockpit, no one will ever be denied their place again."